Hello students and welcome to video 2 in chapter 3.2 sources of finance. So in this video we're going to address this final learning objective, the appropriateness of short and long-term sources of finance for a given situation. So what we want to do first is just say exactly what that means. So firstly we need to define what short and long-term sources of finance means in this context. So what we generally say is short-term is less than 1 year, and long-term is more than 1 year. Now, you might see different definitions here. I've seen one where short-term is less than 1 year, medium-term is 1 to 5 years, and long-term is more than 5 years. But for the IB syllabus, this is kind of how they're defining it. Short-term is less than a year, long-term is more than a year. So what we need to do is basically, for a given situation, we need to be able to discuss which type of source of finance is the most appropriate and whether we want to do short or long-term sources of finance. So common situations, common questions that might come up might be, for example, discuss whether a company should use share or loan capital. This is a very common IB question, and I'll be going through the pros and cons of each in a minute. A second one might be evaluate whether company X should lease a machine or purchase it using a bank loan. So again, different ways of obtaining a machine, and there are pros and cons there. And then maybe compare and contrast whether a company should use retained profit or should they sell assets. Now, with just these questions here, we can't answer these questions. The answer to these questions will depend on the specific context of the company. So obviously we need a case study to be able to answer this question. But what are the factors that we need to consider? Well, what we have here are various factors that we might want to consider when we're looking at what short source of finance to recommend. So the first one is time period. So for example, if a business has a short-term lack of cash, maybe they need to buy a new table or something for their business, then clearly they're not gonna issue shares in order to buy a table. If they need a small amount of money, then something like an overdraft is going to be more suitable, or a short-term bank loan, or possibly trade credit. Buy the table, pay for it later. If it's something more long-term, so maybe they're looking to invest in expanding overseas, for example, then obviously something like a loan or share is going to be possibly more appropriate. The amount needed is important. If they need to raise millions, then share capital can be one of the most effective ways to do it. Depending on the size of the business, they might not be able to borrow millions. And again, this comes back to the period of time. But if it's a short period of time, then raising large amounts might not be appropriate. The costs involved. So, for example, if they're going to take out a loan, then they're going to need to look at interest rates. So, currently in our economic climate, interest rates have been going up quite a lot recently. So, if interest rates go up, then it becomes more expensive to get loans because your interest payments are higher, so it becomes more expensive. And so, if interest rates go up, then loans become less attractive. Conversely, going through an IPO, so going public, can cost millions in legal fees, investment bank fees, consulting fees, etc. So with some of these sources of finance, there's going to be costs involved. The legal structure is important simply because the sole trader and partnership cannot issue shares. Now, what they can do is they can still give up ownership of the company, but they're not called shares. So in this situation, because they've got unlimited liability, then obviously getting investment can be a little bit more tricky because of that. The size of existing borrowing can be important. If a company already has high debts, then it can limit future borrowing. So as a person, if you've got lots of loans already and you go to the bank and say, can I borrow some money? Then they're going to look at how many loans you currently have. And if you've got too many, they're going to say, sorry, we won't lend you money because you've got too many loans already and we see you as too risky. And so therefore, by taking on more debt, it can actually limit how much you borrow in the future. If you're an HL student, in another chapter, we do something called the gearing ratio, where we actually measure the existing amount of debt. Finally, the attitude to ownership and control. And clearly, equity financing requires giving up some control of the business. And the company will need to look at what their attitude towards it is. Some entrepreneurs just don't want to give up ownership of their company. And so therefore, equity finance might not be suitable for them. So, like I said before, a very common IB question is discuss whether company X should use share or loan capital. So, I just wanted to briefly go through the pros of each of these so you're able to understand these a bit better. So, for loan capital, we mentioned this in the previous video, but with loan capital, the bank is lending you the money, which you pay back. So, you're not giving up any ownership of your company. So the bank is not going to take any ownership of your business. Well, some loans they may actually do that, but depends on the nature of the loan and whether you pay it back or not. But in this situation, most loans you don't give up ownership of the company, and therefore you don't give up ownership. You don't give up control over decision making, and you don't need to share any profits of anyone. So you get to keep everything for yourself. You can still make all the decisions, and you get to reap all the rewards of the profit. And as a result of that, it is temporary because after a period of time, depending on the length of the loan is paid back and then it's gone, completely gone, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. So in many ways, and this is not always true, but in general, you could see this as good in the long term because in the long term, once you've paid back the loan, you've taken on the bank loan, you've used it, but you haven't given up any control of the business. On the other hand, share capital, obviously you do give up control, but at the same time, there's no borrowing. With share capital, investors give you the money. You never have to pay it back. But of course, you're giving up the control, which is the pro of the loan capital. So with share capital, you never have to pay it back. So in this situation, you could argue that you can grow quicker through share capital. And the reason for that is because if you're having to pay the loan back, then that's going to be hurting your profit and your profit margins. So there's going to be less retained profit for you to put back into the business. There's no interest payments. So like I just said, this is going to be a cheaper way of doing it. And you could argue that it's more flexible. With interest payments, you have to pay them back. And so if the economy gets worse, you still have to pay them back. If your company makes a loss, you still have to pay your interest payments back. However, with share capital, there's a little bit more flexibility. If your company doesn't make any money, then you probably wouldn't pay dividends. Now, of course, that could be bad for your share price if investors sell your stocks because of not making profit. But if your company makes a loss, you have to pay the dividend with loan capital, but you don't have to pay it with share capital. So you could argue many would see that share capital is good in the short term because effectively you don't have to pay it back and you're risking other people's money to grow the business. Now, on the other hand, in the long term, share capital is worse because you've given up control of the business overall. So there's a brief summary of the pros of loan capital and share capital. Right, we've now finished that chapter. I'll see you next time.